בוקר טוב. אני מודה שרק אחרי שהשתחררתי מהצבא,
So only when I
קצת יותר זמן,
was discharged from the military and I had a little bit more time,
הדיוט, לא כבעל מקצוע.
and then I have
למדתי הרבה היסטוריה והרבה מדעי המדינה.
I learned so much of history, philosophy, and political sciences. I started to understand certain things concerning events that happened.
גם אם חוויתי אותם, לא בהכרח הבנתי אותם.
When I experienced them, I didn't understand them, and I think one of the most important aspects is to understand a certain
נוטים לתת לו חשיבות, אני קורא לו הממד הפילוסופי, שיגידו אולי הממד האינטלקטואלי, ואני אומר את זה
intellectual
ישראלים מאוד מאוד נבחנים.
I think as Israelis, we are being examined, what do you do? Let's forget about all the philosophy. And the military indeed, and especially during the war, is being examined for something. It does, because when you think about action in comparison to thinking, is much deeper tension that exists between those two factors. And I would like to present you an overview that in my eyes are the biggest mishaps of the Yom Kippur War, especially on the level of the general staff. So, and actually, but about the thinking, that was the very shallow thinking, a lack of intellectual depth and criticism that was required, or critical thinking that was required, which purposes, in fact, to identify the logical failures. And this is, in my eyes, is an origin of so many of the problems that were so significant in war, and during the first days in particular. And I would like to talk about, I'll give you 3 examples. First example is very specific, and the third one will be more expanded. They are all dedicated to the topic of the Yom Kippur War, and we did mention here by others an associative connection to the word oversight or failure. The intelligence said that there will not be war, so we didn't recruit the reservist service, we didn't recruit them. The war began by surprise, we were not prepared, we paid a very heavy price. So that's usually the narrative, more or less. This is some kind of basic understanding of the matter. But then at a certain point, maybe in a surprising manner, personally I do, in a way, see as quite acceptable the intelligence mistake. There were so many mistakes of intelligence services during history, because there is another side. They try to mislead you and to lead you to the mistake. As you remember, they started with this wooden horse during Trojan War and Barbarossa War that amazed Stalin, Pearl Harbor that caught by surprise the Americans. Therefore, those surprises happened during war, which is obviously normal. We need to assume that it's unpleasant as it is, but it's possible. But some things unforgivable, which is the logical failures. I have 3 examples. Let's look at the reconnaissance. What in fact did we have? What was the failure here in intelligence analysis? So, and the biggest failure wasn't an intelligence and not a military one, but it was in fact in a philosophical aspect. The head of the intelligence department, Giora, a very smart person, very experienced one, very dominant and very charismatic at that point, he put on the table 3 possible facts. 3 assumptions, actually. And in hindsight, 3 assumptions were correct. And from here, he reached a reasonable conclusion. And let's try to understand where was the logical failure. What were those 3 assumptions he put on the table? First one was Syria will not start the war against Israel without Egypt. Reasonable assumption, in fact, and in hindsight, actually quite correct one. The second assumption that Giora put on the table was when Egypt will decide to wage war on Israel, the strategic purpose will be one, to bring back Sinai Peninsula into Egyptian hands. So if they can't realize this particular purpose, they will not start a war. And the third assumption, and we know that, and even more importantly, Egyptians knew that as of fall of 1933, they couldn't conquer Sinai. They didn't have enough of the pilot jets. They didn't have enough of, actually, they had the SA-6, they couldn't move his forces, they didn't have enough of those batteries. So from their quite sober perspective in 1973, they couldn't really conquer the whole Sinai. And out of those assumptions, the conclusion was there will not be a war. First assumption is Syria will not start the war on their own, and Egyptians, if they will do that, they will try to do that in order to bring Sinai back. But the assumption is that they know that they can't conquer Sinai with their capability they have at that point. Therefore, they will not start a war. And such an assumption was quite reasonable at that point. So what is the logical failure in this assumption? Let's look at the term. There is a conclusion. There is deductive thinking or deductive conclusion. So if I'm telling you that all the Greeks speak Greek language, and this is the initial assumption I have. My second assumption that Socrates is a Greek person, and I am connecting the deduction, the only possible deduction from those two assumptions will be that Socrates spoke Greek, because if both assumptions are correct, there is only one possible conclusion. Socrates speaks Greek. What Elie Zeira actually did in his deductive analysis was in fact to understand that the reality is a reality of deductive conclusion. I have three assumptions and only one possible assumption can be derived from those assumptions. There will not be a war. What actually happened quite surprisingly really, that at all the forums of intelligence and the chief of staff, the prime minister, minister of defense, there was not even one person, senior or junior, that raised his hand and asked a question that one should definitely ask. General Zeira, your conclusion out of three of those assumptions that there will not be a war is a reasonable assumption. But if it's necessarily the only possible deductive assumption that can exist in this reality, and as far as we know, there was also a different assumption that was also possible. That became reality. The Egyptians did distinguish very sharply between the strategic purpose of the war to bring back Sinai and the military tactical purpose that should not be to conquer the whole Sinai Peninsula. And the Egyptians stood. So that said, it's enough for me to organize a very humble military activity, not 300 kilometers of Sinai, but just the width of 10 kilometers. I will kill a lot of Israelis. I will prove that Israel is not invincible. And I will bring superpowers to the arena. And following this war and the shock that will come afterwards, there will be an additional stage, a political stage, in the end of which Israel will bring back Sinai to Egypt. And this is exactly what happened. Quite magically, really. So the mishap from Israel's perspective is not connected to reconnaissance knowledge and ability to analyze a reconnaissance. It's unrelated to any military tactical aspect. It's connected to the very narrow thinking that adopted gladly a deductive conclusion of something that is not deductible, in fact. And this is the logical failure. And logical failures, differently from the mistakes, they are unforgivable. They should never happen. And I'm saying not without any exaggeration, if in 1973, at that period of time, the head of the intelligence service, the chief of staff, the minister of defense, were other people, some Aristotle would have been fulfilling this position. This failure of the Yom Kippur War would never happen because Aristotle would ask the question that you need to ask here. Is the no war conclusion is the only possible conclusion from this particular state of affairs? And this situation never occurred, obviously. And where you do not ask the right question, you never get the right answer, obviously. Another matter is more connected to the behavior of the Chief of Staff, and I think the biggest and unforgivable mistake of Chief of Staff Dado Elazar was connected to the next point. He obviously, and here I do not blame him, of course, accepted the assessment of the intelligence that the probability of war is very low. And that was a statement for months and months before the war. But this is also the very confident statement of the intelligence days before war and on the day of the war. So the Chief of Staff accepted this assumption. The probability of war is very low, so apparently we need to operate based on the highest probability that there will not be a war. Another logical mistake, this is unacceptable completely, in shallowness, because decisions are not made based on probability. Decisions are made based on the purpose, on the content. So if, for example, now near me there will be a construction engineer that is the best expert in the country, and he will say that it's a very low probability of 10% that this building is about to collapse at that very moment within the next hour. But only 10% of probability this building will collapse. I would assume that majority would decide to stop the conference and to step out from this building and not to be exposed to this probability of 10% of this ceiling falling our heads. Why should we do that, though? It's a very low probability, only 10% of probability, 90% nothing will happen. So if you will work based on probability, we should stay in the building. But I'm absolutely sure that when you actually do the assessment of risk and actually multiply of the probability equal the result, you need to compare between two of those outcomes. The outcome of the very low probability of war. But what if the war will happen and they won't be prepared? What will be the outcome of such a lack of preparedness in comparison to the other side? High probability, 90% that the war will not happen, but we will get prepared for nothing with the cost of it. We need to compare the cost, obviously. We need a very strict distinguishment here. Full preparation for war requires a reservist service conscription. Well, obviously has a lot of significance, economical, moral, international meaning. It immediately transmits preparations of Israel for an attack, maybe. We can understand why the professional and political rank didn't want to recruit the reservist service, but to prepare for war with the probability of 10% with their existing regular army has no cost. The regular army is exactly why it exists, to be prepared. And therefore, one can ask ourselves the question, how come the regular army was not prepared for war, and it was not prepared for war? You can say, no, that's not true. On Friday, day before the war, there was a high level of preparedness, readiness declared. There's absolutely nothing to do between readiness for war and declarations, really. Well, I will stay home, we will not go home. That's what it means. But that actually means that if you translate in the clear order of the general staff, that we have on-call immediate situation, and it will be prepared within the regular military, hundreds of different steps that had to be implemented, and it didn't happen. So it's not even enough to say that Japan is for war and readiness for war. We need to say readiness for war and preparations for defense. Because in two of different sectors, there was absolutely no preparation for defense, not because of lack of knowledge in defense, but there was lack of understanding that one requires defense. As the general of the Southern Directorate thought, well, it doesn't matter. We'll just cross the channel in 24 hours. We don't have to prepare for defense. I need to concentrate my powers for offensive. There was no any concept of defensive preparations. So the chief of staff that had to, at that point, to be able on the 3rd of October, 4th of October, to say that I am discerning between two different things. My assessment whether there will be war, I accept that there's a very low probability of war. Between the fact that as an tactical order, the regular army will be prepared for war. Well, they are getting prepared for war until when? So the military will be constantly on high alert? No, in this specific case, the main reason that concerned us was the high concentration of military forces near Suez Canal that has been explained as a drill of the Egyptian military. And this large drill of Egyptian military, according to the Egyptian plans, was supposed to end on 8th of October. So in fact, the cost of on-alert military between the 3rd of October until the 8th of October, when the drill was supposed to end, was zero when it comes to cost. It was minuscule, really. And on the 8th of October, we will see what happens. If it's just a drill and the drill will be over, the military will be back into Egypt, then we'll de-escalate the alertness. But if it's not a drill, we'll be ready. The fact that there was no decision made of that sort is unrelated to a mistake. It's not an error. It's not a false assessment of the current situation. No, it's a logical failure of a deeper nature. It's a lack of ability to compare two purposes, the purpose and the benefit of case A and case B. And this is completely unforgivable, and it was translated when we analyzed what actually happened on 24th during the first day of the war. It's just a string of catastrophes unrelated even to lesser forces prepared. They were not prepared at all. There's so many examples. Until, well, we don't have time until eternity. I will give you one tiny example of, two examples actually from Golan Heights. On the second day of war, two batteries of artillery that were deployed in the area of Johadar, not far away from Tel Faris, 2 kilometers from the border, were ran over by the Syrian military that invaded and obviously penetrated those few kilometers, and artillery can't handle tanks that are way too close and run over them. And there is a question, why artillery? in fact, that in any military defensive perspective should be 15 kilometers at the back. Why they were deployed at the front lines together with the tanks? And the simple reason of explanation, they set alert, high preparation. And they remember it was the battle days. Once in a few months, there were fire exchange between tanks of Syrians and ours. And if the day of the combat, you want artillery at the front lines in order to be able to reach the main range to actually get into the depths of the enemy. But if it's preparation for war, in preparation for war, artillery should be at the back lines. So basically, when you don't have a proper alertness for war as a definition, this is one of the dozen of examples that happened in a twisted way. An outstanding example was the war began on 6th of October, 2 o'clock. They found themselves in one bunker in Nafach and Ramat HaGolan. 3 of the commanding points that were not supposed to be there, and the 4th one that was supposed to be there wasn't there in this bunker from the Division 188. Why are you in Nafach? You're not supposed to be there. You're supposed to deploy your battalion elsewhere. Well, there were other commanding points that were supposed to be in charge of the whole sector because we're moving from the current operations into the war. They had no role there. In an amazing way, the directorate were deployed in Nafach, though, based on all the plans there. Directorate was supposed to be in Safad. Who wasn't there? The directorate that was supposed to be there and to command the Golan Heights of the Division 66 of Raful, because Raful and of his commanders were not there, but they were wandering around other geographical areas instead of being in the sector who was under his responsibility. Lack of preparedness and readiness of the most elementary levels. And I'm moving to the third and last point I wanted to bring up. When we analyze again war, in a war, very often mistakes are made, and mistakes are very bad thing. The results can be quite lethal, but one has to know how to be more accepting of those terms of uncertainty under pressure of time, stress, and fatigue. Think that you need to attack from right, but you attacked it from left, and it failed from the right. It happens. Not always we succeed in wars, and very often we make mistakes, and this is completely forgivable. What is unforgivable, in fact, is there is a phenomenon of ignorance, and ignorance unrelated to making decisions in real time and making a mistake in real time. Whether I am as a certain rank, do I know what I need to know as a part of my role? And what I'm saying, I don't have time to get into details. I think that the head of the General Staff of the IDF, the Deputy Chief of Staff, and many of the very senior rank in the General Staff, the head of the Division of Operations, for example, the commanders of directorates and the commander of the Air Force did not know those very basic things that I had to know as a part of their role at that point of time. They didn't know, they didn't understand, and how to fulfill the role they had in the war. And this is very different from the mistakes one can actually forgive for. You need to prepare yourself for that, and the result of those days was indeed disastrous, not just sad. It was a catastrophical, pathetic, in the way you're just shocked by it. Really, I'll give you one example, and this is why I'll end. Hard day, 7th of October, in the evening, the Chief of Staff goes to the Southern Directorate in Dvela in order to ratify the central program of IDF, the counter-attack of 8th of October. So the Chief of Staff traveled there without the head of operations, without people of the Air Force or intelligence or logistics. He arrived on his own, basically, for toasting with his secretary. So there was the General of Southern Directorate and the headquarters. The one spoke an ancient language of one sort, another one was speaking a different ancient language. They all speak non-military language, completely illegible for both of them, and they left this meeting, 2 people, they all understand completely different things. No any Chief General Staff order was not generated for the central attack, counterattack of 8th of October of the IDF. The Air Force doesn't even know that there is a counterattack planned. And the counterattack of the IDF was performed day after, and in the field it was expressed in the following manner. One battalion attacked in a certain sector in the morning and they failed, and another battalion attacked at the same sector afternoon and failed even harder and absorbed so many casualties. That was the counterattack of the IDF. This can be forgiven if a counterattack fails. It happens all the time. But you can't call what happened day after tomorrow a counterattack of the IDF. It wasn't a counterattack on a battalion level. It has nothing to do with it. It was an expression of not a false assessment of the state of affairs, but a complete ignorance and understanding of processes. And obviously an understanding of what the battalion is capable of achieving and incapable of achieving. And that should not happen when you are arriving and facing a beginning of a combat. It shouldn't happen to senior commanders. And this ignorance, in fact, and it doesn't matter how it emerged, this ignorance was actually completely unforgettable, and that would happen to many of the commanders of the IDF.
You're staying with us? 5 minutes, no longer than that. You've said difficult things, where there is a philosophical insight, strategical point, tactical point. There has been a failure due to a lack of a philosophical point of view and a lack of organizational means. But we still won that war, and if you can explain in 5 years, how did we win? It is true, myself and many others, after many words of criticism and things we wrote, we must really try and make a balance between reality and self. In fact, the answer to your question is, in his last book, Yosef tells, he says, well, we were not that bad. The army was at its best. Someone remarked we were perfect. We were trained, we were united. Tactically, that was a surprise, but the army was ready. It was ready. So this should be also stated. The second thing is that, which is a question of the culture of the lower cadres. I'm talking about the lower grades. Most of them understood very fast the difficult reality, the fact that they cannot really rely on intelligence, on help, assistance from above, and the motto was, this is what we've got, and this is what we have to win with. And the third point, the last one, I think that, and I evaluated and appreciate that, and that was because of Dado. 3 days after big mistakes, he understood two things. Dado, the chief of staff, he understood that we're not as good as we thought, and the Arabs are not as bad as we thought, and we must calibrate all the systems and receive the correct decisions, realistic ones, and starting on that date, his decisions were precise and correct. He understood, one moment, I'm there at the top, but I cannot be the only element who thinks and decides. And when it comes to the chief of staff, to the staff, they tell him, you are right. He said, don't tell me that I'm right.